It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Emily Harper first noticed something was off. She had just finished her morning coffee and was about to head out for her daily jog when she heard a faint knock on her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman from across the hall, looking distraught. "Emily, have you seen Mr. Jenkins? He hasn't been answering his door for days," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice trembling. Emily frowned. Mr. Jenkins was her next-door neighbor, a reclusive man in his late 50s who kept to himself. She hadn't seen him in a while, but she hadn't thought much of it. "I haven't seen him, Mrs. Thompson. Maybe he's out of town?" Emily suggested, trying to sound reassuring. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. No, he never goes anywhere. Something's wrong, I can feel it." Emily sighed. "All right, let's check on him." Emily and Mrs. Thompson knocked on Mr. Jenkins' door, but there was no answer. Emily tried the handle, and to her surprise, the door was unlocked. They stepped inside, and the apartment was eerily quiet. The furniture was neatly arranged, but there was a thick layer of dust on everything, as if no one had lived there for months. "This doesn't make sense," Emily muttered, her heart racing. "I saw him just last week." Mrs. Thompson looked around, her eyes wide with fear. "Emily, this is impossible. Mr. Jenkins has lived here for years. I've known him for decades." Emily's mind was spinning. She walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was empty, not even a single condiment. The cabinets were bare, and there was no sign of any personal belongings. "Maybe he moved out suddenly?" Emily suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "No, he would have told me. He was like family." Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. She went to the building superintendent, Mr. Grayson, and asked about Mr. Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins? Never heard of him," Mr. Grayson said, scratching his head. Emily's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "He's lived here for years. Apartment 4B. Mr. Grayson checked his records. "Sorry, miss. Apartment 4B has been vacant for over a year. No one's lived there since the last tenant moved out." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "That's impossible. I've seen him. I've talked to him." Mr. Grayson shrugged. "Maybe you're mistaken. It happens." Emily left the office, her mind racing. She decided to dig deeper. She went to the local library and looked through old newspapers, hoping to find some mention of Mr. Jenkins. But there was nothing. It was as if he never existed. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Mr. Jenkins and the empty apartment. She decided to talk to Mrs. Thompson again, hoping for some clarity. "Mrs. Thompson, are you sure Mr. Jenkins lived here?" "The superintendent says the apartment's been vacant for over a year," Emily said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Thompson looked at her, confused. "Emily, what are you talking about? Mr. Jenkins has been my neighbor for as long as I can remember. We used to have tea together every Sunday." Emily felt a knot in her stomach. But the apartment is empty. There's no sign of him." Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. "Emily, I don't understand. He was here. I know he was." Emily decided to take a different approach. She went to the police and filed a missing person report. The officer took down the details but seemed skeptical. "Are you sure this person exists? We have no record of anyone by that name living at that address," the officer said. Emily felt a wave of frustration. "I know he exists. I've seen him. I've talked to him." The officer sighed. "All right, we'll look into it, but don't get your hopes up." Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Mr. Jenkins. Emily began to doubt her own memories. Had she imagined him? Was he just a figment of her imagination? One evening, as she was going through her old photos, she found a picture of herself standing in front of her apartment building. In the background, she could see Mr. Jenkins standing by the entrance, smiling at the camera. Her heart skipped a beat. "He was real," she whispered to herself. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Emily decided to visit the local hospital. She asked to see the records of any patients named Mr. Jenkins. After some persuasion, the staff agreed to help. What she found shocked her to the core. There was a record of a Mr. Jenkins who had been admitted to the hospital a year ago. He had been in a coma for several months before passing away. Emily felt a lump in her throat. But But I saw him after that. I talked to him. The nurse looked at her sympathetically. I'm sorry, miss. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially when we're under stress. Emily left the hospital, her mind in turmoil. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. She decided to visit Mr. Jenkins' grave, hoping for some closure. At the cemetery, she found his headstone. It was simple, with just his name and the dates of his birth and death. She knelt down and placed a flower on the grave. I don't understand, she whispered. If you're gone, then who was I talking to? As she stood up to leave, she noticed something strange. The dates on the headstone were wrong. According to the dates, Mr. Jenkins had died before she had even moved into the building. Emily's heart raced. She quickly took out her phone and called Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you something. When did Mr. Jenkins die? Emily asked, her voice shaking. There was a long pause on the other end. Emily, Mr. Jenkins didn't die. He moved away. I thought you knew. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. No, Mrs. Thompson. He died. I just saw his grave. Mrs. Thompson's voice was filled with confusion. Emily, I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Jenkins is alive. He called me just last week. Emily's mind was spinning. She didn't know what to believe. Was she losing her mind? Or was there something more sinister going on? Determined to find the truth, Emily decided to confront Mrs. Thompson in person. She went to her apartment and knocked on the door. Mrs. Thompson opened it, looking as confused as ever. Emily, what's going on? You're scaring me, Mrs. Thompson said. Emily took a deep breath. Mrs. Thompson, I need you to tell me the truth. Is Mr. Jenkins alive or dead? Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. Emily, I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Jenkins is alive. He's been my neighbor for years. I don't understand why you're saying these things. Emily felt a wave of frustration. Mrs. Thompson, I saw his grave. The dates on the headstone don't make sense. And the superintendent says he never lived here. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. Emily, I think you need help. Maybe you should talk to someone. Emily felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know what to do. She decided to leave and clear her head. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed something strange. The nameplate on Mr. Jenkins' door was gone. She quickly went back to Mrs. Thompson's apartment and knocked on the door again. Mrs. Thompson, the nameplate on Mr. Jenkins' door is gone. Did you see anyone take it? Emily asked. Mrs. Thompson looked at her, confused. Emily, there was never a nameplate on Mr. Jenkins' door. He didn't like to draw attention to himself. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She decided to go back to her apartment and think things through. As she sat on her couch, she noticed something strange. There was a photo album on her coffee table that she didn't remember putting there. She opened it and found pictures of herself with Mr. Jenkins. They were smiling and laughing, as if they had been close friends. Emily's heart raced. She didn't remember taking these photos. She didn't even remember being friends with Mr. Jenkins. As she flipped through the album, she found a note tucked between the pages. It read, Emily, I'm sorry for the confusion. I had to disappear for a while, but I'll be back soon. Take care of yourself. Minus Mr. Jenkins. Emily felt a wave of relief and confusion. She didn't know what to make of it. Was Mr. Jenkins alive? Was he playing some kind of game with her? She decided to wait and see. She didn't know what else to do. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Mr. Jenkins. Emily began to doubt her own sanity. She decided to seek help from a therapist. As she sat in the therapist's office, she told her everything that had happened. The therapist listened carefully, taking notes. Emily, it sounds like you've been through a lot. It's possible that you're experiencing some kind of dissociative episode, but I think there's more to it, the therapist said. Emily frowned. What do you mean? The therapist leaned forward. Emily, have you ever heard of gaslighting? Emily's eyes widened. You think someone's been manipulating me? The therapist nodded. It's possible. Someone could be trying to make you doubt your own memories and perceptions. Emily felt a wave of anger. But who would do that? And why? The therapist shrugged. That's something we'll need to figure out. But for now, I think it's important for you to focus on your own well-being. Emily left the therapist's office, her mind racing. She didn't know who to trust anymore. She decided to take matters into her own hands. She went back to her apartment and started going through all her belongings, looking for any clues. As she was going through her closet, she found a box she didn't remember putting there. Inside, she found a stack of letters. She opened the first one and read, "Emily, I'm sorry for everything. I had to disappear to protect you, but I'll be back soon. Wait for me. Minus Mr. Jenkins." Emily felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She decided to wait and see if Mr. Jenkins would return. Months passed, and there was still no sign of Mr. Jenkins. Emily began to move on with her life, though she never forgot about him. One day, as she was walking home from work, she saw a familiar figure standing by her apartment building. It was Mr. Jenkins. He looked older, more worn, but it was definitely him. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Emily felt a wave of relief and anger. Emily followed Mr. Jenkins to a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. He chose a corner table, far from prying ears. As they sat down, Emily couldn't help but notice how nervous he looked. His hands trembled as he stirred his coffee. "Start talking," Emily said, her voice firm but laced with curiosity. "Where have you been? And why did everyone think you were dead?" Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath. "Emily, I didn't disappear by choice. I was forced into hiding. There are people, powerful people, who want me silenced. They've been manipulating everything, including your memories." Emily's eyes narrowed. "My memories? What are you talking about?" Mr. Jenkins leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You remember me because I was real, but they've been erasing me from records, from people's minds, even from your building. They've been gaslighting you, making you doubt your own sanity. And they've been doing it to me too." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Who are they? And why would they care about you?" Mr. Jenkins hesitated, then pulled out a small, worn notebook from his coat pocket. He slid it across the table to Emily. "This will explain everything, but be careful. If they find out you have this, you'll be in danger too." Emily opened the notebook and began to skim through its pages. It was filled with cryptic notes, names, and dates. One name stood out, the Echelon Group. Emily spent the next few days poring over the notebook. It detailed a secret organization called the Echelon Group, a shadowy network of influential individuals who manipulated events, erased identities, and controlled information to maintain their power. Mr. Jenkins had been a whistleblower, exposing their illegal activities, but they had turned the tables on him, making him disappear, both literally and figuratively. As Emily dug deeper, she realized that her own life had been intertwined with the Echelon Group long before she met Mr. Jenkins. Her father, who had died under mysterious circumstances when she was a child, had been investigating the group. His death was no accident, it was a warning. Emily confronted Mr. Jenkins. "You knew my father, didn't you?" Mr. Jenkins nodded solemnly. "Yes, he was a good man. He trusted me with his findings. But before he could go public, they got to him. I tried to protect you by staying away, but they've been watching you this whole time." Emily's heart raced. "So what now? What do we do?" Mr. Jenkins looked her in the eye. "We fight back. But it won't be easy. They're everywhere, politicians, law enforcement, even your neighbors. You can't trust anyone." Emily and Mr. Jenkins began working together to gather evidence against the Echelon Group. They reached out to a journalist who had written about corruption in the past, but just as they were about to share their findings, the journalist went missing. Panicked, Emily turned to Mrs. Thompson for help. But when she arrived at her apartment, she found it empty. A note on the table read, "You should have stayed out of this, Emily." Emily realized with horror that Mrs. Thompson had been working for the Echelon Group all along. Her kindness, her concern for Mr. Jenkins. It had all been an act to keep Emily under surveillance. Mr. Jenkins urged Emily to go into hiding, but she refused. "I'm done running," she said. "If they want to fight, they've got one." Emily and Mr. Jenkins devised a plan to expose the Echelon Group. They hacked into their servers, uncovering a trove of incriminating documents. But just as they were about to release the information, they were ambushed. A group of masked men stormed their hideout, and in the chaos, Mr. Jenkins was captured. Emily barely escaped, clutching the hard drive containing the evidence. Alone and desperate, Emily reached out to an old friend from college, a tech-savvy hacker named Marcus. Together, they uploaded the files to the internet, ensuring they couldn't be erased. The fallout was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and the Echelon Group's members were exposed. But Emily knew it wasn't over. She had to find Mr. Jenkins. Emily tracked Mr. Jenkins to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. She found him tied to a chair, bruised but alive. As she untied him, he looked at her with a mixture of relief and sadness. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you," he said. "I'm not who you think I am." Emily froze. "What do you mean?" Mr. Jenkins sighed. "I wasn't just a whistleblower. I was part of the Echelon Group. I helped them erase people, manipulate events. But when I realized what they were doing, I tried to stop them. That's why they turned on me." Emily felt a wave of betrayal. "You lied to me this whole time?" Mr. Jenkins nodded. "I had to. If you knew the truth, you wouldn't have trusted me. But everything I told you about your father, that was real. He was a hero, and I owe it to him to make things right." Emily didn't know what to feel, anger, sadness, or gratitude. But she knew one thing: they weren't done yet. With the Echelon Group in disarray, Emily and Mr. Jenkins went into hiding once more. But this time, they were prepared. They continued to gather evidence, exposing the group's remaining members one by one. Emily also began to piece together her own past, uncovering the truth about her father's death and her connection to the Echelon Group. She realized that her fight wasn't just for justice, it was for closure. As for Mr. Jenkins, he remained a mystery. Emily didn't know if she could ever fully trust him, but she knew they were bound together by their shared mission. One evening, as they sat on a rooftop overlooking the city, Emily turned to him. "What happens now?" Mr. Jenkins smiled faintly. "We keep going. For your father, for everyone they've hurt, and for us." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Months later, Emily returned to her old apartment building. The nameplate on Mr. Jenkins' door was back, but the apartment remained empty. She didn't know if he would ever return, but she knew his legacy, and her father's, would live on. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed a new tenant moving into the building, a young woman with a curious smile. Emily nodded at her, wondering if she too would one day uncover the secrets hidden within those walls. For now, Emily had a new mission: to ensure that no one else would vanish without a trace. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.